It's that time of year in New Delhi. The smog settling in, debilitating smog, with triple the usual number of cases of kids in hospital with respiratory ailments in India's capital. We'll ask about the cyclical causes, weather patterns, heavy industry, traffic, winter stubble burning by farmers, and more. And then there's that whiff of irony, with this year's smog alert coming hot on the heels of a COP26 summit where India pushed for a watering down of climate goals, refusing to speed up energy transition targets or the phasing out of coal. In the immediate term, what to do? We'll ask about the showdown between activists, industry, the courts, local and national governments. This in the world's second most populous nation. Today in the France 24 debate, we're asking how to clear the air. And joining us from Delhi, Siddharth Singh, author of The Great Smog of India. Thank you for burning the midnight oil, for being with us here on France 24.
Thank you for having me.
From Washington, Irfan Nuruddin, director of the South Asia Center at the Atlantic Council. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you.
You're the author of Coalition Politics and Economic Development. And with us here in the studio, she's just back from Glasgow, France 24, environment editor Valerie de Kimp. How are you?
Hi, François.
The France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. Yeah, schools shut indefinitely. Trucks stopped at the capital's gates at least till November 21st, and the temporary shutdown of at least 6 coal-fired plants around Delhi. Those are just some of the measures to try and deal with air quality that this Thursday was 12 times below the international standard of acceptable. Vedika Bael has more.
A city gasping for breath as New Delhi's air pollution hits critical levels. The Indian capital stepped up efforts on Wednesday to battle the toxic air, shutting down schools, libraries and sports facilities indefinitely and temporarily halting 6 coal plant operations, as hospitals report an alarming increase in children with respiratory issues.
The number of patients that we are getting now because of respiratory infections, both in the OPD or in the emergency, there has been a 3 to 4-fold rise. This is directly linked to the high levels of pollution.
One of the world's most polluted cities, each winter brings a chronic smog as lower temperatures trap pollutants from power plants, vehicle fumes and the burning of crop residue. The measures come days after the Supreme Court criticised Delhi's government for not declaring a pollution lockdown. But environmental experts say that a year-round action is needed instead.
These are done only to ensure that you don't worsen the situation. But it is not a silver bullet that is going to just clean the air immediately, because what has already got loaded in the atmosphere, that can go only when a strong wind will come to blow it away.
A Lancet report published last year showed that over 17,000 Delhiites died in 2019 due to air pollution. This week, the poisonous particulate matter levels have been over 400 in parts of the city, as levels last week touched 500, more than 30 times over the World Health Organization's maximum recommendation.
Siddharth Singh, let's begin with you in Delhi. First off, how is it this Thursday?
Oh, it's quite bad. So today is marginally better from compared to yesterday or day before, but it's still well worse than it should be. It is absolutely hazardous for anyone to be stepping out, be it for working out, for even just navigating the city. Everyone who can afford it is cooped up inside their homes with air purifiers running, and that's the state of the city right now.
Is this just, par for the course if you're a Delhi resident? Or is it worse than it was in previous years?
So firstly, this, as you kind of mentioned in your opening statement, it is a cyclical issue. And it's something that affects us year after year. So it's something that's not surprising to people. Whether it is a few percentage points worse or less bad is not really the issue here, because at the moment, the levels of particulate matter and other pollutants are so high that it would be dangerous even if it were half of what it is right now.
And what do people feel? How do people feel about schools being closed, because obviously we're just coming out of the COVID pandemic, and kids being told to stay home. Well, they've been there before.
It's an absolute state of helplessness, and it's not just, so some of this lockdown business actually affects the poorest people the most, who actually depend on their daily incomes to get their lives going. So I think it's going beyond schools. We also need to think of construction workers, of people who may be employed in the transport industry and so on. And I think in general, there is no easy solution to the problem. On the one hand, of course, you need long-term measures to have a long-term structural change to the issue. But at this particular point of time, there are merits in stopping activity and protecting lives. But unfortunately, protecting lives also means affecting the livelihoods of people. So it's an unfortunately very poor situation all around.
Okay, so you heard in that report that one environmental activist saying there is no silver bullet. But surely there must be one measure that you personally favor.
Unfortunately, I wish I could say there was one thing that sticks out. In fact, the root cause of India's problem is that, or rather North India's pollution problem, is that there is no silver bullet. There's no one issue that sticks out. There is no low-hanging fruit. It's a problem that stems from about 5 to 7 major sources or major contributors, and unfortunately, each and every one of them will need some change. Now, I understand that structural change may take years. If you were looking at something more short-term, you could think of finding ways to stop stubble burning immediately, but that too would have an impact only for a couple of months in the year. For the rest of the year, transport and industry would, of course, continue unabated.
Irfan Nuruddin, let's talk about that a second. Stubble burning, when farmers burn off in the fields the residue of crops. Now, that's not, of course, in Delhi itself, but in surrounding states, and that's part of the blame, because it is that time of the year when it happens. Right now, that's what's being blamed. I know that the media was focusing a lot on firecrackers after the Hindu festival of Diwali last week. Everyone seems to be looking for one culprit in this case.
That's right. I mean, they're looking for one culprit, and they're looking for culprits that don't implicate their own lifestyles. Blaming stubble burning is convenient because it's blaming farmers who live far outside of Delhi. And so the average Delhiite living in large houses, driving cars, multiple cars often per family, does not have to take accountability for their own actions because it's convenient to blame farmers. And in fact, the Supreme Court said just as much, because there are studies now suggesting that stubble burning maybe accounts for 2 to 5% of the pollution. That's not really the issue. The same could be argued for Diwali. Diwali is a problem only insofar as we already have a baseline air quality that is far below any acceptable limit specified by the World Health Organization, or that would be accepted in any developed country. And so when you have all those firecrackers burst to celebrate Diwali, it makes a bad situation worse. Again, it focuses the attention on an episodic cause as opposed to the structural issues of transportation and industry, the lax regulations that govern that industry, and the complete inability of any government, whether Delhi or the central government, also in Delhi, to make hard decisions about how India is going to tackle its pollution crisis, which is not just Delhi, it's across the country. It's not just in the winter months, it's all year round.
Yeah, but on that score, and we get into now the political blame game that's been going on this past week, we have the Chief Minister of Delhi, Arvind Kejriwal, who's saying, okay, you want to lock us down, great, but then do it as well for surrounding states. Does he have a point?
He does. I mean, at the end of the day, Delhi is a landlocked city-state, as it were. People commute in. It is the home not only of the Delhi state government, but obviously of India's central government, a large number of government employees. People commute from long distances into the city, truckers, etc. So He's absolutely right in that at the end of the day, a crisis of this proportion requires a coordinated central government response. It cannot just be on the city of Delhi, which is the recipient maybe of a lot of the attention because very powerful people live in Delhi, because international journalists covering the story live in Delhi. They don't live in Haryana. They don't live in the rural parts of Punjab. So he's absolutely right in saying that the solution cannot simply be a Delhi-specific solution. It has to be a broader North India and indeed pan-India approach to this. 20 of the world's 30 most polluted cities in the world are in India right now. 20 out of 30. So this is not just one city's problem, it's an India problem. And an India problem requires a central government solution to that problem.
A central government solution? What can the state government do in Delhi?
The state government surely has some options, but mainly these are going to be, I think, band-aids. Again, Mr. Singh is an expert on this, and he can disagree possibly on this, but you can have these, modified transport rules, the odd-even rule that they tried, a couple of years ago, and they keep trying every so often. You can have work-from-home requirements that 50% of your office can come in and the other 50% has to work from home. All of that is trying in the immediate to reduce the amount of transportation, the number of cars on the street. You can limit maybe the kinds of trucks and emission standards of trucks coming in, but those are interstate commerce issues that are beyond the capacity of a single state government. And Delhi is not an industrial city. Delhi is a city in which people live and reside and work in offices. It is surrounded by states in which you have heavy industry. So Delhi cannot control the emission standards in those states. It cannot enforce existing laws in those states. It requires, therefore, a statewide solution. Now, the one thing Delhi can do and has done is invest in infrastructure to make public transportation much more amenable for everyday citizens to be able to get in. The Delhi Metro was a huge step in that regard. Much more has to be done in order to shift Indian appetite away from private vehicles to public transportation. But again, frankly, these are all band-aids to the broader structural issue of India being deeply reliant on coal and heavy industry and really being unwilling to tackle at the root cause those issues.
I want to get to the issue of coal, but first, Valerie de Kemp, listening to this blame shifting that we're talking about, who's doing the polluting? Oh, Delhi doesn't make the stuff that doesn't have the heavy industry, but of course, in Delhi there's the demand. It's a city of 20 million for the goods that come from all of that heavy industry. This sounds familiar coming from Glasgow again in the COP26 summit.
Well, yes. I mean, I think that in the last few days, the narrative has been that India and China, they're some sort of the new climate villains in a way. And we saw in those dramatic last moments of COP26 when India and China, they intervened at the last minute for a last minute push to have the final COP26 text downgraded from phasing out fossil fuels to phasing out coal to phasing down coal. And so that we have this image, this portrayal of India being a climate villain, but is India really the climate villain? I think that we need to look at this from the perspective of climate justice and equity as well. And I think that
because what we're seeing on a smaller scale within India is what we're seeing at a planetary level, which is if I'm buying stuff that's made in China or made in India, then who's the one who's polluting? The buyer or the producer?
And that's exactly, I think, the argument that India's environment minister and lead negotiator was putting forward during COP26 and to other world leaders at the final moment of COP26, and saying, how can you expect us, India, to move away from coal, to transition toward greener alternatives when we have a development agenda, when we have people that we need to lift out of poverty? And so you have this notion of common but but differentiated responsibilities. And as you say, I mean, the wealthy countries of the world, wealthy nations, they have massively contributed to this climate change problem. So why should countries, emerging economies like India and China, therefore, answer and be the ones stepping up their climate ambitions and their CO2 reduction targets, for example? So it is a question, as I say, of climate justice and equity.
All right, Siddharth Singh, I want to ask you about coal, but first, can you help our viewers navigate the ping pong we've seen? It's a sort of a three-way tussle, isn't it, between, and we've started to broach the subject, between the local government in New Delhi, the state government. You heard just there, Irfan Nuruddin mention how a lot of these issues are interstate commerce issues, and the Supreme Court. What's going on? Who's saying what? How does it work right now in terms of what authorities are doing?
So instead of trying to dissect what each has said, of course, from each of their perspective, it makes sense to try to to act within their jurisdictions and to, of course, blame what's not being done in other places, and that's very natural, that's understandable. But I really want to get into the policy kind of issues as to why this is arisen in this manner in the first place. So India has a national clean air program. Unfortunately, India's efforts towards clearing the air, cleaning the air, is restricted to the cities, in the sense that these plans look forward to roadmaps and action at the city level. Unfortunately, it's not a city problem in India. In fact, about 70% of deaths that happen in premature deaths, there are over 1 million Indians who die year after year due to air pollution. Over 70% of them live in rural India. So it is, in fact, as much a problem in the rural parts of the country. If you look at maps, satellite imagery showing particulate level and other pollutants, you will see that our airshed, the area which has a common sense of weather conditions and geography, that airshed extends from Pakistan all the way to Bangladesh, with all the northern Indian states in the middle. So solutions cannot come if it is left to the
sorry to
devices of the
interrupt.
state.
Is that down to what? Because you heard a moment ago, Irfan mentioned how winter stubble burning by farmers is only a little part of that. What is air pollution in rural areas? What's it down to?
So, stubble burning, firstly, I mean, I will debate the percentage. The thing is that different studies come out with different numbers. And I think that it really comes down to whether you're looking at an annual average. So over the course of the whole year, you may find that stubble burning has a very, very small percentage, because that makes sense. Stubble burning happens on only 2 times of the year and lasts for a few weeks. But at the moment, for example, today's data, which looks at model contributions in Delhi, we see that about close to 15% is due to stubble burning. And that may, in fact, be as high as 50% on some days, but only on some days. Mr. Nuruddin is actually right that if you look at it in a longer time period, it's, on an average basis, it has a smaller share. Therefore, you should not be blaming the farmers. It is a problem. So in rural India, the use of firewood and other traditional biomass for cooking is a major problem. In fact, about 600,000 Indians die, and this is a part of the million, due to air pollution that's caused due to the use of firewood indoors for cooking. So India has, for example, an LPG program where it's trying to subsidize and ensure that LPG reaches people. But despite those subsidies, we still have millions of Indians, hundreds of thousands of households relying primarily on cheap or inexpensive or probably free firewood for their cooking purpose. In fact, this is one of the reasons why India and other countries have been supporting the use of fossil fuel subsidies in the particular case of cooking, because unless we're able to transition people away from traditional biomass towards LPG, towards electricity, we will not really be able to, impact this problem at the rural level.
And Siddharth, people listening to this show from Africa, they have the same problem. So what's the alternative if you live in a rural area and you want to cook a meal?
Unfortunately, at the moment, it comes down to between LPG, liquid petroleum gas, or it's firewood. Because unfortunately, the kind of reliability that you need from electricity supply does not exist at the moment. In fact, even if a country like India were to go all in with electrified cooking, it would mean that there would be electricity demand peaks in the evening and the mornings where probably the sun isn't shining, and therefore more coal will be used to produce that electricity for people to cook. So unfortunately, it's a dilemma that a country like India faces. We do need to transition people towards cleaner cooking options. Electricity could form the solution, at least in urban centers, but for much of rural India, LPG is still the way to go.
Irfan Nuruddin, we were reading reports about how a couple of years back in Punjab, authorities promised the farmers that they'd give them subsidies if they didn't stubble burn the crops, and they never came up with the money. So therefore, they said, well, we're back to using it. And they also said there's not much retribution because that would be politically unpopular. So how's the current government handling farmers?
That's a loaded question in a broad sense. I mean, let's start with Punjab. The chief minister, new chief minister in Punjab, just announced that all the first incident reports, which is essentially the first stage in a potential criminal case against farmers for stubble burning, would be quashed, that he was not going to enact any of them. So the no retribution is pretty critical. But this gets into a much larger sort of questions around farmers. As you undoubtedly know, I mean, India's farmers, and especially in North India, from Punjab in particular, but also from the other states, have been protesting a set of farm laws that the central government enacted. For now, over a year and a half, they've been out on the streets. It's the longest, largest protest in any country, anywhere in the world, frankly, in history. It's over time, because of the pandemic, been moved off the front pages, but it continues to be there. So the political force of the farmers in India is not just large, it's always large. It is particularly sensitive right now because of this long-standing, year and a half long protest that they've been engaged in against these farm laws. It means that the Punjab government, which is ruled by the Congress party at the current moment, which is of course the opposition to the BJP government, which controls the central government, has very little incentive to do anything that is seen as anti-farmer, because that is in fact a significant vote base that they're trying to capitalize on. Mr. Kejriwal in Delhi, whose party is called the Aam Aadmi Party, or AAP, also has ambitions to court this farmer vote as his party seeks to gain greater currency in broader North India outside of Delhi. So unfortunately, the farmers are going to be a bit of a ping pong ball in this, in that lots of people will blame them, but nobody's got any incentive to actually force them to do something different, because politically that's very, very sensitive over here. On the climate justice issue, if I may, I mean, the real trick with that question is not to deny the climate justice issues that lead us to the current moment globally, but also maybe to be honest and say that the climate justice issues are just as pertinent domestically. The estimates are that the average Indian loses or would gain 6 years of life expectancy if India could reduce its air pollution to World Health Organization standards. The bulk of the deaths, as Siddharth very correctly said, are poor people in rural India who are dying of this. The children who are filling those hospitals in your opening segment are likely to come from poor homes in slums, etc. But the urban India is an India of deep, deep inequality, incredible disparities. And the notion that that is not in itself a climate justice issue that has to be tackled by the government, that cannot be blamed on Paris, on London, on Washington, D.C., I think is also a fair question to ask in a democratic society, to say, what are you doing about the fact that our citizens today are dying because of air pollution caused as much domestically as anywhere else? And I think that's a debate, unfortunately, that we aren't seeing yet in the Indian electorate, and maybe that's why no government really has a great political incentive to do much about this.
And Irfan Nuruddin, when you're tackling this issue of climate justice, we've been hearing people saying, most notably from the United States, that when it comes to cutting our carbon habit, it's the private sector that's the driver of this. And I know that in India, that farmers' protest that you've been mentioning that's been going on for more than a year and a half now, part of it is over reforms that favor the private sector. Is government part of the problem or the solution when it comes to climate justice?
Well, I think in this case, I would argue, given the choice, it has to be part of the solution. The fact of the matter is, and Siddharth again mentioned the National Clean Air Program, which has a significant urban bias. Urban voters are quoted in a way that rural voters are taken for granted. It means that we favor the consumer habits of rich middle-class Indians over the vast majority of the country that does not enjoy that kind of earning power. It means that we have industrial policy that's biased in favor of polluters and in favor of big business as opposed to from a consumer perspective. In September, the government canceled the FCRA, the foreign contribution licenses, essentially allowing non-governmental organizations and civil society to receive foreign contributions. It's been doing this over and over the last 7 years. But the most recent set included companies essentially because they were arguing against coal. Environmental organizations in India advocating for less coal, because advocating against coal is seen as anti-national activity that violates the FCRA regulation of the government. That is not just about climate justice. This is an active policy to hobble democratic debate and civil society around the energy transitions in the country in favor of business. So I think what we have over here is a government that has unfortunately abdicated its responsibility to make some of these decisions. And frankly, the tone that the Supreme Court has taken in this is quite surprising for what has essentially been a Supreme Court and a judicial system that has been quite weak-kneed in opposing the government, because they have essentially said, this is bureaucratic paralysis, this is government inaction that is literally resulting in the deaths of tens of thousands of Indians. Do something. So government has to be part of the solution. Without it, to expect private sector to do everything required, it's not happened anywhere else in the world. It's not going to happen here either.
Valerie de Kemp, when you were in Glasgow for COP26, did you ask yourself, what is it about coal? Whether it's Donald Trump in the United States or Scott Morrison in Australia, and what we're hearing here about it's being anti-national if you are against coal in India, as described there by Irfan Nuruddin.
I think that the reality, though, is that it's going to be very difficult for India and other countries as well to kick their addiction to coal. In India, for example, 70% of their energy comes from coal. So that is, an important, step that they need to overtake. And also, as much as 4 million people rely on the coal industry in India as well. And I think that on the international stage, coal has been portrayed as a low-hanging fruit, as something that's easy to tackle because it's this dirty industry that nobody really likes. But what's interesting, though, is that on the final COP26 text, we mention coal because it is a low-hanging fruit, but we don't mention oil and gas, and those are massively used in the US and the EU, for example. So this essentially shifts the blame towards developing nations and poorer countries that rely on coal.
Is it because we're in this kind of perfect storm moment where we had lockdown, the world's economy goes into hibernation, and now it's suddenly everybody at the same time wants to restart their economy, hence the price of oil, the price of gas shoot up, and people turn to whatever they can, and China refiring their coal plants, that saying go ahead with coal, and India, same thing.
This is the challenge as well for countries like India and China. They need to strike the balance between, pressure from the international community saying you need to strengthen your climate plans, you need to come up with more ambitious CO2 reduction targets. But on the other hand, they have the domestic context as well. And just a few days ago, the former Environment Minister of India was saying India needs to be responsive on the international stage, but also responsible on the domestic front. And that's because, as you say, countries in India, they are experiencing the consequences of the economic fallout of the COVID-19 pandemic. And we know that their energy demand, they're not able to meet their current energy demands, but the demand is actually increasing, but still they're saying we are committing to 2070 net zero emissions. We want to increase the share of renewables to 50% by 2030. So one analyst was saying this is actually pretty audacious to say that we're not meeting our energy targets. Our demand for energy is actually increasing, but still we are committing to transitioning towards greener alternatives. And I think that's something that we need to celebrate.
Siddharth Singh, we don't need to go to West Virginia to see what happens when the coal mines stop. Eastern France is still reeling from the closure of coal mines 40 years ago. And so is there a plan in India to help the transition away from coal and to help those who work in that industry?
So unfortunately, at the moment, there is no such plan. It's something that I think it lies ahead of India in the sense that all the transition activity that has happened so far has been mitigating the growth in coal by replace or rather substituting it with solar and wind and so on. The path towards actually declining the share of or reducing the share of coal, that path is not done. India's coal production, India's electricity production using coal has all been increasing over the last few years. So I think the need for just transitions, they lie ahead of us. One study showed that about 40% of India's districts have some reliance on coal, and there are a few very critical districts where a significant chunk of the state's revenues, their social welfare, healthcare, all of that is provided for by the coal industry. So I think in India's case, it's going to be very dire. And if there is a just transition plan, it should definitely focus on those particular districts where we have about a few million Indians who are reliant on this industry.
And forgive me for being a little wonky here, Siddharth. What about the grid? Because what's key is if you want to transition away from coal, you need an electric grid that's able to take in all these diverse renewables such as solar, such as wind.
Absolutely. In fact, the problem in India's case is not just on the supply side. So, of course, if wind and solar were to provide about over 50% of India's electricity generation by, say, 2030, on the other side, on the demand side, from about 30 million air conditioning units, it is expected that India will have over 600 million air conditioning units. So that would create a demand peak as well, which does not coincide with the supply peak from solar and wind. So this creates a massive problem for the grids. One study has estimated that India may just have the largest requirement for flexibility options for the grid. In fact, the clean energy investments required in India in general will need to increase 5-fold over the next 8 years until the end of this decade for India to be able to invest into the grids and other clean energy infrastructure needed for India to eventually head to a net zero path by, say, 2070.
Irfan Nuruddin, you're sitting in Washington. The U.S. has similar problems in parts. So when you look at that, what's your thought about the way India is going to tackle this huge challenge going forward?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to be optimistic about the climate situation globally. We had, COP26, which is a former Minister of the Environment of India said to me when I talked to him in April about what he expected from COP26. And I said, what do you think COP26 will accomplish? And he said, they'll schedule COP27. And I suspect that that's exactly right. I mean, so on the one hand, forgive the pessimism on this one. We've got a global solution. We don't have a lot of ideas. And I think actually we are in real danger of missing a boat that is completely devastating to the poorest parts of Indian society and to global society. So with that said, I think what we're learning in the US is that nuclear energy is seen increasingly as being something that they need to figure out how to do more and more of. That renewables themselves, for all the reasons already stated, are going to be hard to make the complete transition because we still don't have all of those technologies, and this is even more so in India, where it's not just that the grid is insufficient, you don't even have proper connectivity across state lines of grids. So it's not even like states with a surplus of energy can sell it to states that need it, etc. So you've got a lot of very basic investment in infrastructure required that makes the 2070 goal, which the government has already kind of suggested was the Prime Minister talking non-technically and didn't really represent a national commitment, it's very unlikely to see how India gets there significantly. Now, India has made climate finance a large part of the conversation. I applaud the government for raising the climate finance question. That one thing that the international community, and in particular the West, has an abundance of is capital, and that capital, if invested smartly through new technologies, is maybe the one ticket out of this. The question, of course, is whether the government has put in place the policy framework that incentivizes international capital flowing into India. At present, investors abroad say no. In the US, that's not the issue. The technological innovation happening in the United States right now on climate-friendly policy is pretty humongous, to use a technical term. And so I think the real challenge for India is going to be to create a similarly technologically sophisticated ecosystem that gives it a fighting chance of dealing with some of these problems.
All right.
But it's a tough road ahead.
Yeah, tough road ahead for everyone, particularly as you mentioned there with climate finance. And since there will be a COP27, Valerie De Kemp will be covering it. In Egypt. Many thanks. I want to thank as well Siddharth Singh for being with us from Delhi, Irfan Nuruddin in Washington, D.C. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.